Hello everyone, and welcome to part 1 of the IPControl Callout Manager series. In this video, I'm going to discuss a service within IPControl which allows for custom interfacing to transactions as they occur within IPControl so that external processes and or external systems can interact with IPControl on a dynamic basis as these occur within your organization. The best way to view this information, and I kind of pull up a quick graphic to represent this, is IPControl is the central of the IP address management. All transactions, whether they're through the web UI, through a command line interface, or even through an API, are performed on that IPControl executive or its backup. And there are various policies that will enable, as certain types of transactions occur, that all of the data attributes that are associated to the transaction can be passed out to a callout, as we refer to it, and every add, modify, and delete transaction can then have a script that can process that data. As we pass into the callout manager, we're going to tell it what script, and we're going to pass an argument, which is going to be an output file that represents the transaction's details. That includes things like your IP addresses, subnets, domains, blocks, etc. So the reason we want to kind of look into this information is if you have third-party applications or if you have any other northbound type application where you want to take the results of a transaction, feed it into an external system, and then allow further processing of that data through whatever process chain you have for your block or IP or server provisioning. So in this particular example, as your administrator assigned, if I added an IP address as an example, it would allow us then to run a custom script. And that custom script may do things like email. It might run a database insert into an external data source, or it may even do something like upload it into a workflow that can then determine things like in the device approvals and or the ability to set up when someone has a requested change and you want to have an approval process, we can interact with email in that particular instance. And in video 2 of this series, we're going to go to a custom callout that I've designed that's going to help us interact with this approval process. So as these transactions occur, we'll send it out to a callout. That callout will upload it into our cloud automation appliance, which will then process this based on its delete or create, and or whether it's being approved or rejected. And we're going to kind of follow this through, and this will be described in video 2, so maybe check back with that so that you can see how that might work in your environment. The way that the callouts work is under the tools, policies and options. By the way, prerequisite is that you have an active IPControl executive and that you have SSH access if it's running on Linux or the Sapphire appliance. And we're using our IPControl executive on the appliance to demonstrate this today and to walk through this, but that is a prerequisite in this setup. So after you've entered this, navigate or scroll down the screen until you find the various enable policies, which enable us to turn on or off each of those individual callouts. And just so that we can kind of see how that callout process might look, we can take a look at the Callout Manager file, configuration file, on its server. And in this IPControl executive in the opt-in control directory, we have a file called callout_manager.properties. This properties file controls each of the individual callouts, allowing us to define, as an example, if I add a block that I want to execute this shell script or this Perl or Ruby or Python, whatever scripting language you're comfortable with. And the idea is that during that transaction and its type, we're going to pass out a file that represents the properties, and then you can do something with that file. So the first part is we need to enable these policies. Now, if you're running this in a lab, and of course going through the evaluation series with us, I see no issue with doing this in the lab for this purpose. If you're in production, make sure you're doing this on maybe a scheduler change if it impedes with your performance in the server. We make sure that you test things before you do this. But what we have, let's go ahead and just turn these on or off. So in the block callout, every time we add any type of block, that's a root block, a aggregate block, which is your summarization range, or a subnet. When this transaction occurs for an add, delete, modify, we're going to send this out. So we're going to say true in this. Same thing with the IP addresses, except we have two format outputs. The first is your device format output, which follows the import device and more specific field representation. And then you have an IP address representation with keys off the IP. I'm going to use device since we have some other functions involved with this process. As you assign DNS domains or make modifications, add, delete, you can make a call out there as well. And then as we do the task call out, we will have this ability to go in and as we initiate tasks to perform discoveries or to run DNS DHCP deployments to their services, as those tasks are started or if they are completed or if there's errors, etc., each time they complete, we can have this task call out to a process. And the last one here that we would cover would be the workflow call out. Through IPControl, there is an approval process, either for DNS resource records or for IP devices, and hence our format on the top. That setting is defined at the bottom of your policy screen called workflow type, and it's an and or either or option here. You can either run resource record approvals or device approvals. So you may want to experiment around with this to see which way this works. However, note that a device, if assigning DNS records with that device, that its approval process includes both the IP assignment and its DNS records in terms of its deployment to your servers. Now, if you're following along, go ahead and hit submit, which will save those changes, and that will enable those through IPControl so that we can now go in and configure our Callout Manager properties so that we can actually see the files and interact with those in terms of their content. And our first step here is to go ahead and open up a PuTTY shell. You'll want to SSH to the IPControl executive IP address and log in as your Inc. admin user with its password defined in your OS. And when you do log in, you should automatically be logged into the opt-in control FTP root directory, which is the default. So we'll cd .. back to in control, which is the root directory basically of the application where we have various property files to manipulate those. So what you want to do is you'll want to run either a VI or a Vim and open up those files so that you can view and edit those. And I'm going to do this through my WinSCP, which you can also do if you have an editor to do this remotely. So if you have WinSCP, you can log to that directory and open and edit that file, and then you can save it back remotely, and that might be easier to work with. So to begin with, in this file, there's a few things to note. The first is that we have here the ActiveMQ connectivity. So whenever the Callout Manager starts up, whenever a transaction occurs, it pulls that transaction off of the persistent queue and then pulls that into this and then monitors the type. Now, where you have that file output to is by default set up to opt-in control temp. Because I interact with these files a lot of times, I want to set up a different directory. So in your particular case, you want to cd to opt-in control temp and perhaps create a callout directory, which I have here as well. This will say that all of the callout files would be directed to this output directory. There are two options for the output format. The first is to output XML, and this is commented by default, which is not on by default. The default value is a field name value pair. So it has a field name equals value. So that might make it easier for you. In my process, I have a callout, which is going to be that Node-RED workflow. And so I want this to be processed in XML. You can pick and choose that format. Also, where we work with the Callout Manager. This is also built into our alerting capabilities within IPControl itself. And just to quickly show you under Tools and under your threshold sets and block threshold sets, whenever you define that threshold and you specify what the threshold is in terms of its severity and the variable that you're actually observing to compare, and then you can look at absolute or percent values. And effectively what happens is when you run these thresholds through the discovery, and in that discovery there's going to be a global utilization rollup. This rollup will trigger any alerts on your subnets as you've defined them under your block, container, or threshold sets for your network services. So when those trigger, they're going to call a callout. And that callout then could be defined here where it says alert callout sh. So if I wanted to run a script, I could have an email function here perhaps something that went out and did some other checks or sent it to an alert to an SNMP trap, anything that I can do with a script I can call here. And then when this process calls this script, it's going to pass it again that argument, telling it the file, which will be stored in that opt-in control temp callout directory. So then to kind of walk through these just kind of quickly to keep this video in a manageable time. The block add, modify, delete, you can enable these if you want to take a look at this process and see what the output is. And that's kind of what we want to do here. I want to go ahead and enable these because I want to take a look at the files. And then we can see the device. We can look at the device, modify, and delete. And there's others here when we get down into the device merging, say if we're merging multiple interfaces to a device, your DNS domains, if we wanted to see an add, modify, or delete, and then we go down even further. So I'm going to just go ahead and enable some of these so we can see these. One note is I do have this current workflow set up that will work with the email. So this one is already set up for the device workflow, and we'll see that example again in video 2. Last note on this particular file before we exit out and save it and then restart the service. The Callout Manager on the IPControl executive, the IPControl executive monitors your remote appliances, whether running DNS DHCP, and it does that in an interval delay, I think it's like 60 seconds, and it keeps the status of both the appliance, IPControl, and all of its services, i.e. DNS DHCP, and we therefore have a status check that we can trigger whenever these events occur on any of the remote appliances. So we can centrally monitor the appliances, and each one of these appliances even has additional callouts that can set SNMP or email alerts as well. So if you're interested in monitoring these services, both on the executive and remotely, we can do all of that here, uncommenting each of these and then allowing us to set up tasks that can then send off a script to do something with the data. And this also includes a replication monitor on the executive to monitor the delays or if we're getting any lag between the primary and the secondary. All right, so when you made these changes, we need to make sure we save these. So the first part is it will save it out to your file, and then we need to restart this service. To restart the service, you can cd to opt-in control etc, and the service name is CM, which is Callout Manager, and just type in CM space restart. That will stop the callout, and that'll restart it with your activated policies as defined. And as we've enabled those policies within IPControl, every time now we make that transaction, it should send the details to the output. And just so we can kind of see how that works, let's try to do this real quick and get an address that we can work with. So we'll go ahead and search down into our subnet, kind of in my lab here that I'm working, and we'll just do @next_IP, which will grab the next. And then we're just going to give it a name, and I'm going to give it server. We'll give it a name automatically inherited. The domain's already set defaults. It'll create the DNS records. I'm going to go ahead and just add my email, davidcross@bt.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. I am not the comedian, by the way, but would not mind his. Never mind. So here we are. I'm going to go ahead and submit this, and that will save the transaction into the database. It's created the IP address. And I expect now that it should have also called out to the Callout Manager where I should have some type of file that I should see in this list. And I'm going to see if that actually, called it out. And there we go. So now the callout file itself, the structure of this represents CM, which is Callout Manager, _ depending on that output XML, true or false, it's either going to be XML or NV for name value. You'll then have an ID, which is a session or transaction ID. Then it'll be dot, whatever the data type was, so device, block, ready for preview, etc. in terms of pending changes. And then its function, add, delete, modify. So we, in the name itself, try to name it something that's sufficiently enough to determine in the script, just based on the name itself, what transaction or what processing needs to occur. And as we look at this, and I'm looking at the device callouts, you'll see here this is the device. This would be IP address if I had selected that option. And it then goes through all of the various attributes, the administrator, the date and time. It goes through the device interfaces that were created, their MAC address. We have the IP integer, which is stored here if you're doing multiple IPs and sorting or determining things, and then even the IP ID. And the idea is important to us if we're interacting with any of the APIs. We can modify this device by supplying the ID and then modifying any of its attributes and re-importing. So there's some things we can do with this data. But lastly, the idea being that if you need to do something further outside of IP control, this is your immediate interface if you want it done on a per transaction basis. And we've done things within this script like custom dynamic DNS updates. This is where you might be able to do something with it, or even add that to the different DNS domain outputs. So not to continue talking too much, I wanted to give you this example of the file. And in this file, though, when we start to do uploads and we get into the further examples, you can see how this might work in more of a real time and kind of open up some ideas, at least, about how you can turn this processing into more of a reporting type engine or a collection type engine where your security teams and other teams might interact, kind of in real time. You might need to have this sent off as a checks and balance or something in your particular process. So that's what the IP address looks like in terms of that setting. And let's see if we can quickly do this again with the subnet so we can see that view. And I'm just going to grab the next available. We'll do this very quickly. Okay, we're going to assume defaults for everything else. And that should have also sent out a call out since we enabled the block structure. Let's go ahead and see if we can refresh this. And again, there's your block ad. And so if you're a subnet administrator or a network administrator, this might then be where you're going out and provisioning a site. So it either could have come from another interface into IP control, creating this and then passing it back out, or doing some other processing. Okay, so I hope you got something out of this, and I hope that it helps open up your eyes a little bit about some of the things we can do with the call out and where you can interface and kind of build into your processes, how you do things. Not necessarily what we think you should do, but what you do. So thank you for your time today, and I hope that, again, you got something from this about the call out. And if you have any questions, let us know. Feel free to send me an email or however you can get hold of us there. And then come back on video 2 and take a look at the example where we'll send an update into the Callout Manager to the Cloud Automation Appliance and do some automated workflows. So take care and hope to see you in the next video. And if you have any ideas or comments, feel free to share. Thank you.